It's always a work in progress. Okay, so here we are looking at the eye. This is an anterior view of the eye. Let's take a little twirl around, show yourself off. Okay. So this is the eye, and the eye sits in this bony cavity in the skull called the orbit. Okay. So that's where the eyeball sits. Let's start off by maybe trying to identify some external features of the eye. First of all, this is the right eye. So, it's going to be on that side. Does anybody have any idea what this large structure is right here on the lateral side of the eye? That's the lacrimal gland. Okay. So it's a gland. It secretes substances. What does the lacrimal gland produce?
Tears.
It produces tears. And those tears run across the front of the eye, and then they drain out the lacrimal duct on the medial side of the eye. And what do tears do? Yeah, on a day-to-day basis, they're washing the eye and they're lubricating the eye. Good. What about all of these red structures here? What are these? Well, what type of tissue does that look like, first of all?
Muscle.
It's muscle. What type of muscle does it look like? Smooth, skeletal, or cardiac? It's skeletal muscle. Okay. And collectively, I believe there's 6 of these. These are called the extrinsic eye muscles. Extrinsic meaning on the outside of the eye. So these are skeletal muscles on the outside of the eye. And what do? What's the job of these muscles? They move the eye within the orbit. Exactly. So what happens if this muscle right here on the lateral side of the eye contracts? Which way does the eye move? Does it move this way or that way? Moves towards me. If this contracts, moves the eye this way. If this one contracts, moves the eye back that way. Skeletal muscles. What am I trying to say here? Skeletal muscles pull. They don't push, type of thing. What about this muscle on the top? Look up. Muscle on the bottom. Look down. Okay. Now, skeletal muscles, these skeletal muscles are under voluntary control. So what part of the brain is going to be responsible for let's say you want to move your eyes around, move them left, right, up, down. What part of the brain are those commands coming from? What part of the cerebrum, what lobe of the cerebrum are those commands coming from? Where does conscious control of skeletal muscle movement come from? It comes from the frontal lobe. And specifically, there's a little band of tissue right in front of the central sulcus called the primary motor cortex. And we'll revisit that when we talk about the skeletal muscles. Okay. So that's the primary motor cortex.
The eyes work together. So I had surgery when I was 5, and they had to cut something, but they wanted to cut both sides because it would pull from the other side. So do they connect, or I don't know, I was 5, so but that's they had to do both because it would affect the other side, but why?
I'm trying to move one eye, independently of the other. So how do they connect? How, I guess?
I don't know, if one were to be cut or whatever, would the other one be affected by it?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I just don't know the answer to that, but it's a good question. So we have somatic motor neurons that are coming down and they're innervating these extrinsic eye muscles. What type of nerves are these motor neurons traveling through to get to these extrinsic eye muscles? Do they travel through cranial nerves, or do they travel through spinal nerves to get there? They travel through cranial nerves. Remember, cranial nerves serve structures of the head and the neck. And this is a lot more in detailed question, but does anybody know the specific cranial nerves that carry the motor neurons that are going to innervate these extrinsic eye muscles? I heard two of them in there. The first one is cranial nerve number 3, which is the ocular motor nerve. What does oculo mean? Eye. Motor means movement. And so 4 of these 6 external eye muscles are controlled by cranial nerve number 3, the ocular motor nerve. And the other 2 are controlled by cranial nerve number 4, which I'm just going to double check, is the trochlear nerve. So let's say that you suspect damage. Let's say you had some injury to the head or the neck region, and you wanted to go through all the cranial nerves to check whether or not the cranial nerves got damaged. How would you check for function of cranial nerve 3 and number 4? What are some things you could do to check for damage to the ocular motor and the trochlear nerve? Tracking tests. Hey, follow this probe. Can you follow it that way? Can you follow it that way? Up, down, without moving your head. Can your eyes follow that? And what you're testing is whether or not that information is traveling to these skeletal muscles, these extrinsic eye muscles, through those cranial nerves. If not, you could have damage to some of those cranial nerves. Good. Okay. The outer portion of the eye is really tough. And you guys will see this when we dissect the cow eyeballs. It's super tough. And whenever I think of a structure being tough, I think of collagen fibers. I think of dense irregular connective tissue. The pericardial sac around the heart, the dura mater around the brain, that's all tough tissue that resists stretch. And the eye is similar to that. The eye is a really tough structure. And this outer layer of the eye really contributes mostly to that tough nature. It's a fibrous structure. And most of that outer layer is represented by this area, which represents the white of the eye. What do we call the white of the eye? Okay, the white of the eye. You look into somebody's eyes, you see that white portion. What is that white portion called? I realize you haven't talked about this yet, but that's the sclera. Okay. So the white of the eye is the sclera. And then as the sclera moves anteriorly, it becomes clear. And so you have this clear dome in the anterior portion of the eye. And you can't really see that. I mean, it's right there, but you can't see it because it's clear. But what is that clear dome that forms the anterior portion of the eye? That's the cornea. Good. It's really uncomfortable if you scratch your cornea. I used to have a little wiener dog, and she, used to get in it with cats, and those cats would sometimes scratch that cornea, and it just causes all sorts of uncomfortableness. Good, so that's the outer portion of the eye. Lacrimal gland, external eye muscles, sclera, cornea. And then we get inside the eye. But maybe first, we should, well, no, that's all right. Let's stay on this right. Let's stay on the right path here. So here's the cornea, this clear lens. So when light first enters the eye, it has to pass through the cornea. Next, we have this structure. And there's two different things going on. You have this outer layer, I guess, this colored portion of the eye, and then you have this hole right in the middle. What do we call this outer portion? In this case, it's brown, but it could also be blue or green or anything like that. What do we call that? That's the iris. That's the colored portion of the eye. So again, when you're looking at the eye, that colored portion of the eye, interior to the sclera, is the iris. And then what do we call this hole right in the middle? That's the pupil. So when light travels through the eye, it travels through the cornea, and then it travels through the pupil. And that's how it gets inside the eye. Now I should say, when the cornea and pupil are in their correct orientation, when the cornea and the iris are in their correct location, there's a little bit of space in between there. And that's filled with fluid. And that fluid is called aqueous humor. Okay, aqueous humor. Does the pupil always stay the same size? No, it changes sizes. The pupil can become larger or it can become smaller. What's a situation where you would want the pupil to become larger? Low light situations. Fight or flight situations. Exactly. You want more light to come into the eye. What about, when would you want the pupil to become smaller?
It's really bright.
A lot of light, yep. What's the opposite of sympathetic? Parasympathetic, resting and digesting. When you're eating a meal and there's food right in front of your face, you don't need a lot of light coming into the eye. So you want your pupil to constrict. Now, how's that going to happen? Does anybody have any idea how that pupil is going to change size? I will say this. The iris is made up of muscle. And it's made up of smooth muscle. Okay. Is smooth muscle under voluntary or involuntary control? It's under involuntary control. So this is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And it's not shown here, but there's actually two layers of smooth muscle that make up the iris. There's an inner layer that represents a circular layer of muscle around a circular layer of muscle, and then you have an outer longitudinal where the fibers are running longitudinally, I guess. They're radiating outwards.
I have a question.
Yeah.
For some reason our pupil didn't get bigger and smaller correctly. Is that a case where people need glasses or something, or it would affect their vision poorly?
If your pupil can't change size, then I would check the cranial nerve. I'd be concerned about the cranial nerve that's and the other nerves that are controlling that.
How do you think that would affect our vision?
That's a good question. And pretty much what I'm telling you guys now is my extent of knowledge about the eye.
Oh, okay.
As far as pathology and nearsightedness, farsightedness like that, I have very, very limited knowledge about that type of stuff. But we'll at least get the foundations of it down. So let's say that you want you're outside and you're taking a hike through the woods and you hear some rustling in the bushes. That's going to stimulate your fight or flight response, in which case your pupils are going to dilate. Okay, how does that happen? Well, what happens is that the sympathetic nervous system comes in and it causes the constriction of the outer layer of the smooth muscle. So this outer layer of the smooth muscle contracts, and that pulls on the pupil, and it increases it in size. Do sympathetic neurons travel through cranial nerves? Or do they travel through spinal nerves? They travel through spinal nerves. What part of the spinal cord do sympathetic neurons originate from? The sympathetic system is referred to as the thoracolumbar division. So the thoracic region of the spinal cord and the lumbar region of the spinal cord are where those sympathetic neurons are going to come out and innervate this outer layer of smooth muscle. What about if you want your pupil to constrict? Or not if you want it to, but what if you're in a situation where you're just on the couch, for instance, resting and digesting, and you want that pupil to constrict? That's where parasympathetic neurons are going to come in, and they activate this circular layer of smooth muscle around the pupil. And when you have a circular layer of muscle around an opening, we call that a sphincter. Okay? And when that muscle contracts, it constricts like so, and it decreases the size of the pupil. Where do parasympathetic neurons originate from? Do parasympathetic neurons travel through cranial nerves? They do. They originate from the brainstem and also from the sacral region of the spinal cord. Okay, so the parasympathetic neurons that come in and are going to cause constriction of that smooth muscle, that are going to cause constriction of the pupil, are going to travel through cranial nerves. And I'm going to double check here. But those parasympathetic neurons that innervate the iris also travel through cranial nerve 3, the ocular motor nerve. Okay. So what's a test that you could do besides the tracking movements of the eye? What's another cranial nerve test that you could do to test for ocular motor function with regards to the pupil? Put a light in their eye. If you shine a light in their eye, that pupil should constrict. And if it doesn't, that means something's wrong with those parasympathetic neurons that are traveling to the iris.
In a situation like a concussion, a lot of people are sensitive to is that because their eyes aren't dilating, or is that more like brain?
That could be. That makes sense that they're not able to constrict their pupils, and so there's just a lot of light coming into their eye. That would make sense. Good. So light travels through the cornea, through that aqueous humor, through the hole in the iris called the pupil, and next it travels through this clear structure, which is it's made up of proteins, and it's really hard. You'll see this in the cow eyeball. It's super hard. You can take a scalpel and you can cut through it, but it's a really hard structure. And this sits right behind the iris. What do we call this?
Lens.
That's the lens. Okay. And so light goes through the pupil and it hits the lens, and the lens refracts that light up against the back of the eye. Okay. Any pathology that you guys know about the lens? What do you call it when you have clouding of the lens? That's cataracts. Yeah.
What is it that is like clouding? What?
So this is made up of proteins, interlaced proteins, And when those proteins denature, when they lose their structure, it causes them to become cloudy.
Okay. Because I've seen like procedures where they stick a needle in there, and like, what do they do? Because it clears up. But like, you know. Sorry.
Again, that's it. Yeah, all good questions. All good questions, but magic.
Yeah.
You know. Okay. And so that light travels through the back of the eye, and it hits this structure in the back of the eye. The eye is made up of 3 layers. We have this outer fibrous layer, the sclera. We have this next inner layer called the choroid, and then we have this next layer which lines the back of the eye. What is this flimsy structure, really delicate structure that lines the back of the eye? That's the retina. And what do we find in the retina? We find the sensory receptors that detect light. What do we call sensory receptors that detect light? What do we generically call them? Those are called photoreceptors. 2 types of photoreceptors, 2 main types, rods and cones. What type of light do rods detect? And Suzanne is going to be really impressed when you guys just come into class and you guys are just rattling all this stuff off. Rods detect darker colors, shades of gray. Okay, they're activated at night. And cones detect color. So you have photoreceptors back there, rods and cones. And then what happens is all of those photoreceptors merge together and they leave the back of the eye through this space right there. And the space where they leave the back of the eye, we call that the optic disc. What's another term for that optic disc, the region where all of those photoreceptors come together and merge out the back of the eye? That's your blind spot. Because really there's no photoreceptors there. It's just axons that are traveling out the back of the eye. I do want to pick up with that and talk about what happens to that information as it leaves the back of the eye. But there's another structure I want to talk about. It's part of this middle choroid layer, and it's this right here. And that's called the ciliary body. The ciliary body is also smooth muscle. And the ciliary body has these small little ligaments attached to it, and those ligaments attach to the lens. And so the lens doesn't always stay the same shape. It can flatten itself out, or it can become more rounder, more bulbous, I guess. And that's all dependent on the constriction and relaxation of the smooth muscle in the ciliary body. And when we dissect cow eyeballs today, you'll see the lens. And what I want you to do, instead of just popping the lens out, I want you to take a little probe and run it in between the lens and the ciliary body, and you'll be able to pick up those little ligaments. You'll be able to see those little ligaments that attach the ciliary body to the lens. Okay. All right, so those photoreceptors travel out of the back of the eye, and what structure do they form as they leave the back of the eye? That's the optic nerve. Cranial nerve 1, the optic nerve. Sorry. Correct me there.
2.
Cranial nerve 2. Number 1 is the olfactory nerve. Number 2 is the optic nerve that goes out the back of the eye. And ultimately, where do we want to send that information? We want to send it to the back of the brain, to the occipital lobe. How's it going to get there? And maybe first off, how is that optic nerve going to travel through the bony skull to even enter inside the skull? And I like this because the next thing that we're going to get into is the skeletal system. And we're going to talk a lot about the skull. And this is a nice colored skull model, which shows the individual bones. And one thing that I want you to notice is that the orbit is made up of a whole bunch of different cranial bones. Okay, there's a whole bunch of different cranial bones that form the orbit. You have the frontal bone, the maxilla, the zygomatic bone, lacrimal bone, all that type of stuff. But this red coloration in the back is part of a bone called the sphenoid bone. And if you look at it this way, this is all the sphenoid bone. It has these big wings right here. And at the back of the sphenoid bone, there's a little hole in the back called the optic canal. And the optic nerves travel through those optic canals, and that gives an entrance inside the brain. And I can stick these probes through there.
Oh, that's really cross.
Exactly. So those optic nerves there we go. Those optic nerves travel through the optic canal, and what do? Right on top of the sphenoid bone? They cross. And that area where they cross at is called the optic chiasma. Okay. And then after that, the optic nerves, after the chiasma, become what we call optic tracts. And what is this telling you? One, it's telling me that some of that visual information on the right side from the right eye is going to go to the left side of the brain and vice versa.
It's the same, like if you have a stroke, what side it affects in your body?
Yes. Yep, exactly. And, not all of the visual information from the right is going to go to the left side of the brain and vice versa, but, a lot of it is. A lot of it is. Where's the next step? Before we get to the occipital lobe, where's the next step for this visual information traveling through these optic tracts? Where does all sensory information that's eventually going to go to the cerebral cortex passes through this one structure in the brain, and then this structure sends it out to the appropriate location in the cerebral cortex? What part of the brain am I thinking of that receives all this sensory information and then distributes it to the appropriate location in the cerebral cortex? That's the thalamus. Okay, it's the thalamus. Here we have an anterior view of the brain. This is a posterior view of the brain. And what did we say this lobe was in back? That's the occipital lobe. And that's where that visual information is going. And the first place it goes in the occipital lobe is an area called the visual cortex. What happens when that information reaches the visual cortex? That's when we see. We don't see when our photoreceptors are stimulated. We actually see when that information reaches the visual cortex in the occipital lobe. The next place it goes is in the occipital lobe is an area called the visual association area. What happens to it there?
Is that where we make sense of it?
That's where we give meaning to it. Exactly. So what would happen if you had damage to the visual cortex region of the brain?
Blindness?
You would have some degree of blindness. What would happen if you had damage to the visual association area of the occipital lobe? The visual cortex was fine, but the visual association area was damaged.
Would it essentially be blindness as well?
Vision's blinders.
What's that? Would you be able to see?
Blurred vision.
So the visual cortex, the area that actually allows us to see, is fine. So we would be able to see. But the visual association area where we give meaning to it is damaged.
Would it kind of be like we might as well be blind because we can't understand what we're seeing?
I don't know if I'd put it that way. You might as well be blind, but you'd be able to see, but you wouldn't be able to give meaning to what you're seeing.
Be confused or?
It would be confusing.
It's weird.
It would be confusing because you'd be able to see, but you wouldn't be able to give meaning to it. And I believe a lot of cases of facial blindness, the inability to, we had a nice discussion on this in my 241 class, not being able to recognize people's faces has to do with damage to that.
What about color blindness? Does that have to do with that too?
No, I think that's something else. I'm not sure exactly what that's due to.
Yeah.
It's super complex. 70% of the sensory receptors in the body are in the eye. 50% of the brain is involved with some form of visual processing. An enormous amount of the brain is dedicated to visual
So
processing.
the being color blindness has nothing to do with the occipital lobe like area?
I can't say that for certain, but I don't think that's the
Since it all
case.
goes back to there.
Yeah.
And so does that make
It might have to do something with the type of rods and cones that are involved.
I have a question. Is that kind of why like people that are blind have really sharp other senses because like
Frees up areas of the brain.
it's like 50% of the brain isn't being used in a way?
Frees up areas of the brain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That movie, the guy's blind, but he's like super cool.
Not sure.
Come on.
Okay, good. So that was a good review of the eye and where that information goes.